Last weekend I was at a concert with some friends and they introduced me to some new friends. One of the new friends I met works in the field of climate justice with a national organization. I was asking her about what her job entails specifically, and she was describing working with people all over the country and helping them to organize around climate justice. When I told her it sounded like she had an important and a difficult job, she kind of laughed and then said, "It's much harder these days to get people to organize around this because so many people have given up hope." When I asked her why they've given up hope, she said she thinks it's because of knowing how little time there is left to make drastic enough changes to make a difference in temperatures and other things that will influence major climate events. I told her I was surprised because it seems like if time is of the essence, it would be easier to organize people because the motivation would be so high. We continued talking for a bit and then went back to listening to music. As I've been working on this sixth principle of nonviolence, my conversation with her has been in my mind. Part of what this principle includes is the idea that the nonviolent resistor has deep faith that justice will eventually win. Without hope of justice prevailing, there are very few people capable of nonviolent resistance. Hopelessness takes the reason for resisting without violence, at risk to oneself and one's community, away. The other part of what this includes is that the nonviolent resistor believes that God is a God of justice. This one is tricky given that an atheist can also be committed to nonviolent resistance. We've been talking about Dr. King's book, Stride for Freedom, which is a description of the nonviolent resistance used for the Montgomery bus boycott. All through his book and the details of the more than year-long boycott, there is a deep sense of the role that people's faith played in giving them strength and patience and perseverance. There is also a theme in that book of hope. Dr. King describes moments in that book when he thought people were so discouraged the whole thing would end. But in those moments, something would happen that would inevitably lead to hope again. Believing that the universe, notice it doesn't say God, believing that the universe is on the side of justice is what gives people the motivation to resist nonviolently. Hope that justice will be coming or will be done is foundational to nonviolent resistance. When I was looking for a text to use that would illustrate this belief in justice and the hope that fuels our action, I was surprised to learn that Jesus never used the word hope in all of his teachings. I did a word search in Greek, and the word hope does not appear in any of the Gospels except for one time earlier in this chapter in Luke, when Jesus is saying to the crowds, "What good does it do you if you lend to someone with the hope that they will repay you?" That's the only instance of Jesus saying the word hope. Jesus was not talking about hoping for any particular kind of world. Instead, Jesus spent time teaching about what to say and do in order to build that world. Once I realized Jesus wasn't teaching about feeling hope or having hope, I started looking for a teaching that would embody what we might think of as hope. The text that Sophie read earlier was my choice. In that section about judgment, about self-awareness, and tending to one's soul, Jesus teaches that many people will claim to know him, but don't follow his teachings. Jesus then goes on to say, I'll tell you what it's like when someone hears my teachings and does them. It's like a person who builds a house and does the hard work of digging deep and making a solid foundation on rock. When the floods come and rain and water smash against the house will stay standing because of the strong foundation on which it was built. Jesus goes on to say, but the people who hear my teaching and don't put it into practice build their houses on no foundation, and when the floods come, the house is destroyed. Though the word hope is never used in this text, I have wondered if hope is the foundation in the construction project of all of us. One of my professors from seminary was J. Christian Becker, who I read from earlier. He was a real character. And beyond that, he was a known expert on the Apostle Paul and Paul's apocalyptic teaching. Dr. Becker grew up in Holland and had a secure family life until World War II, when he was taken to a forced labor camp by the German occupation forces. It was that experience and the various influences and impacts it had on his life that led him to write the book, Suffering and Hope. While I don't agree with some of his conclusions overall, I think he's done a brilliant job of demystifying suffering and certainly of disabusing the reader of any notion that there is nobility or martyrdom to be found in senseless suffering. Dr. Becker also examines what constitutes authentic hope. What he makes clear throughout the book is that authentic hope may not be possible without having suffered. And suffering sometimes leads to spiritual death or physical death if there is no hope. Where I disagree with him is his conclusion, as I understand it. He's quite brilliant, so it's possible I misunderstand some of his reading. But as I understand it, his conclusion is that the only authentic hope there is comes from apocalyptic hope. The idea that one day God will make a new heaven and a new earth and all will be well. I have seen and experienced authentic hope in movements for and moments for justice. I have seen and experienced authentic hope in the power of a community of people working together for the good of all. I have seen and experienced authentic hope in the unexplained or serendipitous, or some would say providential, or simply miraculous things that have happened that allowed for justice and love to make progress together. Like when Senator Sarah called me in May of 2023 and told me she had money for me, and that resulted in our $250,000 state grant to launch the Faith Community Initiative to house, support, and accompany new arrivals in Chicago. Her phone call was a huge win for justice and love for migrants. Another experience of hope was Wednesday night when John Lee and I went down to the DuSable Museum for the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability special hearing on the ordinance to create an office for gun violence reduction. I went as part of the Faith Coalition of Live Free Illinois. We have been working together on this ordinance for 5 years, and some of them have been working on it for 7 years. I was one of the latecomers. Our group was asked why it hasn't been passed yet and what the obstacles have been. Someone spoke to what happened during the Rahm Emanuel administration, and then during the Lori Lightfoot administration, and then I spoke to what we have experienced so far with the Mayor Johnson administration. As I was listening to the others, I was thinking about how much time and effort has gone into this over so many years. You can't imagine the numbers of meetings we have had about this. I'm sure there are some who think we should just give it up if 3 administrations haven't been willing to pass it. But I could hear myself thinking, but we're so close to getting it passed. And then later on, I heard myself thinking, the people who have been and will be victims and survivors of all kinds of gun violence cannot afford for us to give up. We have definitely faced an uphill climb all the way, and part of what keeps us going is our belief in the necessity of this office to provide transparency, accountability, and funding, and our hope that the mayor and the city council will see this light and know this is a necessary step to reducing violence long-term in our city. If we didn't have hope that this would pass, I think we'd stop our campaign tomorrow and focus on other priorities because we have many other things we're working on. But knowing how much it's needed for long-term violence reduction and having the hope that with enough community and civic support we can make it happen, we keep going. Hope is foundational. Who starts a campaign of any kind that they think they can't win? We were rewarded on Wednesday evening with several people speaking to the necessity of this ordinance to create the office, including former Chicago Police Department Superintendent Eddie Johnson, who expressed his solid support for it. Dr. King's reference in one of his speeches to the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice is a phrase that comes from the 19th century abolitionist, Unitarian minister named Theodore Parker. He wrote about it in 1853 when things were looking bleak. America seemed to be sliding toward civil war over the institution of slavery, which Parker was trying to get abolished. Parker wrote this: "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." Dr. King used some of this phrase in 1965 when the 3rd attempt was made to march from Selma to Montgomery. The 3rd attempt was after what we know of as Bloody Sunday, when the marchers were met with tear gas, dogs, fire hoses, and horrific beatings. On the 2nd attempt, they were ordered to turn around, and they did after Dr. King prayed. This 3rd attempt was on Sunday, March 21st, 1965. The marchers were protected by 2,000 National Guard members and federal marshals. They marched for 5 days, and 25,000 people from all over the country, of every race, religion, and class, had come to march for civil rights. Dr. King was not allowed on the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery because of Governor George Wallace. So they improvised, and he ended up standing on a platform that had been built on a flatbed truck and he gave his speech on freedom. Dr. King implored them to remain committed to the nonviolent philosophy of civil disobedience, knowing that the patience of oppressed peoples wears thin, and that our natural inclination is to hit back when struck. Dr. King asked rhetorically, "How long will prejudice blind the visions of men, darken their understanding, and drive bright-eyed wisdom from her sacred throne? How long will justice be crucified and truth bear it?" In response, Dr. King offered words of counsel, comfort, and assurance, saying that no matter the obstacles, it wouldn't be long before freedom was realized, because, he said, quoting religious and biblical tropes, "Truth crushed to earth will rise again. No lie can live forever. May it be so, God. You shall reap what you sow," if only that were true. "And the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." So in response to the questions of how long came this phrase, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." This speech is one of his most important and impactful speeches, and this phrase about the arc is one of his most quoted. This phrase is important in part because for so many, it not only speaks of hope without using the word, but it is the reason for hope, that the ideal of the moral universe, and implicitly God, is on the side of justice. In my lifetime, as well as many of yours, the question that prompted the answer about the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice, that has been asked over and over again in so many instances of injustice, is the question of how long will it take for justice or social justice to become reality? How long will it take for the treaties to be honored here in the U.S. with Native tribes? How long will it take for racial discrimination and violence to end? How long will it take for reparations for Black Americans whose ancestors were slaves? How long will it take until anti-Semitism is history and not a daily occurrence? How long will it take for Israel to end its occupation of Palestine? How long will it take for the violence in so many African countries to end? How long will it take for the war in Ukraine to end? How long will it take to end the dictatorship in North Korea? How long will it take to end the U.S. interference in Central and South America and so many other parts of the globe? When our answers to any of these questions become never or forever, we begin to slide into hopelessness. When hopelessness takes over, the motivation to remain committed to nonviolence wears thin quickly. If violence will bring about a change more quickly or even has half a chance in comparison to ongoing, seemingly ineffective nonviolent resistance, it becomes appealing. It's also a way to release some pent-up rage. Unfortunately, there are no instances where violence helped a cause toward justice. Just as nonviolent resistance has been seen as passive, so has hope, as explained by the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. The part that is missing is the part that requires us, the community of God, the beloved community, even the community whose ground may not be in God, but in seeking justice and love together. It requires us to help the moral arc of the universe to bend toward justice by our actions. At the end of his book, Stride for Freedom, in the chapter called Where Do We Go From Here?, Dr. King describes how much longer justice is taking because of the fear that keeps people from speaking and working for the truth. Too many moderates stood by. Too many preachers stayed silent. Too many politicians worked both sides and all sides and whatever side was convenient in the moment. Too many liberals refused to push. Hope cannot be a passive thought or feeling or wish before we blow out a candle. Just as the followers of Jesus had to dig deep and work with rock that is almost impenetrable in order to build the house on a solid foundation, so too do we have to dig deep and ensure the foundation is stable. Our hope is built on a deep belief and experience that God envisions a world that is good for all, not just humans, but non-humans as well, and we are called to co-create that world. Our hope is not idle or passive. Just as nonviolent resistance requires incredible courage and commitment and daily actions, so does hope. Daily, we work toward bending the arc of the moral universe toward justice. When we began this series 6 weeks ago on July 14th, I said this: the point of talking about Gandhi or even Dr. King is not because the conclusion is, so go and be like them. The point is that for every person, including both of them, there is a lifetime of choices to be made and actions to take that lead to the spectrum of violence and nonviolence. Remember, this was July 14th, the day after July 13th. And then I said, when you heard the news about the shooting at the Trump rally, what was your first thought? Now, what do you wish your first thought had been? If you're anything like me, you might have had a violent first thought. Rather than beat yourself up about it, a more productive response would be to ask the question, what has led me to this place? And what is one thing I can do to reaffirm my commitment to nonviolence, if nonviolence is our commitment? Noticing is important, and then taking one step or committing to one action is helpful. Maybe the action we commit to is refusing to add to conversations that celebrate violence in any form. And then I ended that first Sunday of this series with, I'm grateful for this 6-week period to learn and contemplate the ways of nonviolent resistance. I don't want to become my enemy. Instead, I want to follow in the ways Jesus lived and taught. We can feel despair for a moment, and then let's get to work. Our ongoing work as this series ends is to continue our noticing, to committing to actions every day that help us embody the 6 principles of nonviolence, and continuing to talk with each other about the difficulties these principles create for us. No matter what happens on November 5th of this year, we will need to be prepared as we can be to not answer violence with violence. I'm joining the march on the DNC tomorrow to help raise awareness regarding immigration policies. The theme of the march is liberation for all. If there's violence that breaks out, I am committed to nonviolence. For as long as I can remember, and I can't even pinpoint the first moment, I have believed that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. As I've gotten older, I understand more than ever that the hope I hold is a hope I have to work toward every single day. When I get tired, when we get tired, we need to rest so that we can be ready to wake up and begin again. The same is true for all of us. It's part of why this work is done in community, so that while some are resting, some are still working. May we follow in the ways of nonviolent resistance that Jesus lived and taught. Amen.